Welcome to Think Change. Europe is once again confronting war on its continent at a moment when the rules, the norms, and the expectations have shaped security for decades are under strain. Alliances feel less certain, deterrence is less predictable, and responsibility is more contested, just as the United States reassesses its global role and power competition intensifies. And again, this backdrop, Europe is really being forced to confront some difficult questions, not only about how it provides for its security, but actually about what security means today. Military first, state centric models are dominating the debate, and yet they sit uneasily with the realities that are shaping today's risks: climate stress, economic volatility, humanitarian crisis, technological disruption, and obviously the declining trust between major powers. Rearmament definitely matters, but is not enough. Questions of energy security, of social cohesion, of resilience, of political legitimacy are now central to what security looks like in practice. At ODI Global, security has become an increasingly important part of our work, with ODI Europe, our Brussels-based office, really at the heart of the debates shaping Europe's security future. Recently, we convened an event on the security we need, rebalancing military spending for a sustainable and peaceful future, with Izumi Nakamitsu, the UN Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. You will find more on that discussion and on our wider security work in the show notes. So in this episode of Think Change, we ask what it would mean to redefine security for the world Europe is navigating today. How are risks being understood? Who carries responsibility? And what needs to change in policy choices and in institutions if security is to respond to a more complex and a more contested world? I'm really delighted to be joined by Benedetta Berti, the Secretary General of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Ingeborg Denissen, the Deputy Director of Security Policy at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our own Dora Meredith, the Director of ODI Europe. What a great group of friends and colleagues for this conversation. Benedetta, let me start with you. The role of NATO has historically centered on collective defense and deterrence, but the war in Ukraine and the broader geopolitical competition have obviously exposed stresses in all security assumptions. You are the Secretary General of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. How should NATO's priorities evolve beyond traditional military deterrence to really address the interconnected security challenges of today, from climate-linked instability to economic coercion and, of course, hybrid threats?
Thank you for the question, Sara, and it's great to be on this podcast. So I think, let me start by saying I completely agree with the frame. We are in a particularly volatile security environment, and we know we have to face simultaneous threats and challenges. Some are more conventional, some are better suited to be responded to with military tools, and other, like economic coercion, energy blackmail, or strategic dependencies, are better suited with different, needs to be tackled with different tools. So I agree with the frame. I would say for NATO today, there is a strong rationale why our primary mission and our first priority is really rebuilding our deterrence and defense posture and investing in collective defense. That is because essentially, if I take a look at the 30 plus decades after the end of the Cold War, especially as European countries, because we were driven by the assumption that the security environment was far more benign, we did spend much less, significantly less, compared to the Cold War decades, in deterrence and defense in our militaries. And that created over time significant capabilities and gap that today we are very much invested in filling. So I would say when I sit and I look at this from a NATO perspective, I would say our piece of the puzzle is to ensure that we can really ensure the collective defense of allies. And that means more investment in defense and a stronger defense industrial base. And that's why last NATO summit, there was that historic pledge to reach over the next decade the 5% of GDP on defense, with a 3.5 really dedicated to military capabilities. But what I would also like to underline is that while I do think that this is a priority and is absolutely necessary, we also recognize that that's not enough. And that's why even when you look at the 5% defense investment plan, 1.5% of that GDP is actually supposed to be earmarked for investment in our critical infrastructure, investment in cybersecurity, investment in security cooperation with our partners. So all of those elements are recognized fair and square as central elements of how do we build and sustain credible collective defense. And I think that's very important because it essentially says we understand that, yes, we need military capabilities, but we also need strong cyber defenses. We need a critical infrastructure that is resilient, secure, redundant, that cannot be weaponized, that is resilience against external disruptions and attacks, including those derived from climate change, not just because of sabotage or armed attack, all types of disruptions. And we also know we need to invest in civil preparedness. So all of that is very much explicitly included in the 5% defense investment plan. And I would also say, very importantly, that commitment also includes and recognizes as a contribution to collective defense what we provide to Ukraine as Ukraine exercises its right to self-defense against aggression. So all of this together, I would say, yes, of course, we need to continue to have a more sophisticated and nuanced and multifaceted understanding of security. But I think we are very much walking in that direction, including with the 5% defense investment plan.
Thanks for laying it out so clearly, Benedetta. I mean, Dora, you've been really involved in a lot of these conversations in Brussels. How is the security architecture of Europe changing, and what does it mean for Europe's long-term strategic position?
Great. Well, hello, Sara, and it's really great to be with you today. Well, as you've said, these discussions are very live, and indeed, let me start by saying that Europe's security architecture is shifting in three fundamental ways, as I see it. And together, they're forcing Europe to rethink its long-term strategic position. So firstly, as we've seen very clearly in recent weeks, Europe can no longer assume the stability of the Euro-Atlantic centre of gravity. So while the US remains indispensable, its strategic focus is widening towards the Indo-Pacific, towards the Americas, and as we've seen, towards domestic priorities. That doesn't mean the US is necessarily stepping back, but it does mean for Europe that it's got to plan for a world where American attention is more thinly spread and more unpredictable. And so for the first time in decades, Europe has really got to think seriously about what it must do for itself and how it does that. And there's a lot of discussion about that here in Brussels. Secondly, as I think we were just discussing, the threat landscape has expanded far beyond traditional military confrontation. As we've just heard, Russia remains, a very acute threat, and I think that is very much at the forefront of people's minds. But Europe is also facing climate-driven instability, economic coercion, cyber attacks, and hybrid operations that deliberately blur the line between internal and external security threats. And that really does demand, as you were outlining, this much broader concept around security, where you can integrate defence into other policy areas, such as resilience, industrial policy, cyber capacity, and climate adaptation. So really, you've got to take this multi-dimensional approach. And then thirdly, Europe's partnerships are not yet configured for this reality. So the EU has an extensive network of external relationships across Africa, across the Indo-Pacific, with key middle powers, but they are quite fragmented and inconsistent, and often overshadowed by national foreign policies. We often hear from partners when we're talking to them about their relationships with the EU, that often they're not sure whether they should be dealing with the EU or with a member state or both on some of these topics. And in this sort of competitive, unstable world that we're increasingly in, we can't have this lack of coherence. And that really does become a strategic vulnerability that we can't afford. So I see those three shifts leading to two core reflections for how Europe needs to think about its long-term strategic position. Firstly, the fiscal reality. So indeed, the 5% target for NATO members. This will mean, a dramatic increase of defence budgets for many members. And in the short to medium term, that will create real decisions for governments around the choices that they need to make and the trade-offs. And at ODO Global, we've been doing a lot of work around that. And secondly, the need for Europe to match the threat environment with a broadened, integrated strategic approach. And that really means treating external action, crisis prevention, and long-term partnerships not as on the edge of security, but really as central pillars to it. So therefore, really looking at how it builds coherent partnerships, how it draws across those different policy areas, and brings more alignment to reinforce Europe's security objectives.
Thanks, Dora. Ingeborg, given what we've heard from Dora and Benedetta, what does practical burden sharing look like for Europe? And not just in defense spending, but as we've heard, other things that we absolutely need in diplomacy, in industrial capacity, in global partnerships.
Yes, thank you, Sara, and also thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure. Echoing the previous speakers, I think that there's a lot of rapid changes going on currently, and that Europe is really refocusing its energy on, firstly on its own security environment, because it really requires a lot of effort also to keep supporting Ukraine and keep adding pressure to Russia, because this is what the most direct security threat to our continent is. So if you ask me, what does practical burden sharing mean? In the first place, it also means that we ensure that we build long-term support to Ukraine, and that we do so in an equilibrated way. Then, indeed, you also talked about NATO burden sharing, and we have seen indeed that European countries have agreed to spend 5% on defense. And absolutely, it's true that they have to. National governments have to make important decisions in this regard. I'm glad that we are actually trying to do so in the Netherlands, but it's a lot of effort, because first it's really making the decisions about how to spend, how to ensure that we keep up with this defense spending targets, but also how do we ensure that we build our own defense industrial base? And it's not just a matter of governments choosing to, but we really have to think about, beyond our national industries, how do we work together? How do we make sure that we have a proposition for companies? And to make sure that we actually also can translate these financial resources into capabilities that can actually be used to defend and deter. And then there's the issue of how do we actually organize ourselves. And for us as the Netherlands, it's very important that we look at it, particularly in the face of these broader challenges, and hybrid challenges were mentioned several times. How do we use different organizations? And NATO indeed is focused very much on defense and deterrence, but how do we organize NATO-EU cooperation, for example? Because the EU is not the same as Europe. We talk about European security. We're not just talking about the EU, but the EU is a very important partner in ensuring that we can actually finance these defense capabilities. So EU-NATO cooperation is a very important topic for us. But we're also looking at how can we ensure cooperation with very strong EU partners in Europe, such as the UK, Norway, and others. And I think just an important issue is that this, in a practical sense, right, this shift takes up a lot of capacity in our own governments. So I think it also forces us to look at where we can actually, how can we still invest in partnerships outside of Europe, because they're on the long term they're as important, but we have to balance it off against what we have to do, by investing in ourselves.
Thanks, Ingeborg. Benedetta, let's stay on this issue of the cooperation. I think Europe is simultaneously expanding defense spending and debating strategic autonomy, and in the meantime, trust between major powers is deteriorating. How do you see the balance between strengthening these collective defense commitments and building broader cooperative frameworks that go beyond military alliances?
I actually agree with the last point about rebalance, about finding the right balance between investing in ourselves, in our own capacity, strength, and ability to be resilient against an increasingly more coercive, contested, and competitive environment. So I think that's really, really important. And we cannot get around, we cannot avoid the fact that this is the security environment we live in. But at the same time, of course, we need to try to maximize areas for cooperation whenever our interests align with others. So that's kind of the balance that we need to strike. Then I would say, as Europeans, I completely agree with the prior interventions around the list of homework and the direction of travel. And that is one where, yes, there is a strong transatlantic framework to think about deterrence and defense, but the sharing of the burden, that old term, that burden sharing discussion, is now no longer, it's really in a different stage. We're now talking about future of NATO, not so distant future of NATO, where Europeans, allies, and Canada, so European members of NATO, including Norway, including the UK, including Turkey, take gradually the leadership when it comes to the deterrence, to the conventional deterrence and defense of the alliance. That still has a strong US component, and investment and involvement, but it is fundamentally a different trade-off and a different alliance than the one we grew up with, especially in the post-Cold War era. So I think that change is happening. I think needs to continue to happen. It will also strengthen the European pillar. So a stronger Europe in what is essentially a fairer NATO. And that continues to occur. At the same time, of course, we also need to continue to invest in partnerships, and that will be, in my view, in the security field, will continue to also be driven by what are the shared challenges we're facing. For example, at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, we have a very strong relationship with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, and we worked together on issues around strengthening defense industrial cooperation. That's also a topic that is very high on the NATO agenda for these partners. With other partners, we work on how do we contribute to stability in the region, for example, to training and capacity building on issues such as democratic control of the armed forces or security sector reform. All of these are different pieces of the same puzzle, which are how do we build a flexible, interest-based, interest and value-based, pragmatic agenda for cooperation. And I think, that's, for my point of view and from the discussion I hear, very much the direction of travel. So investing in our own deterrence and defense, in our own strength, in our own industrial capabilities, prioritizing partnership based on our strategic interests and also shared values, and building that flexibility that we will need in a world that is ultimately a lot more complex and contested than the word some of us grew up with in the post-Cold War, more benign security environment, so to speak.
Absolutely. Ingeborg, you wanted to come in on this as well?
Well, I think it's indeed the balance that matters, because that you have to think about, where do you put your focus, because it just takes up a lot of capacity. So even if we would want to do everything that we did earlier, we simply cannot. And as we have to take more responsibility for our own security, that necessarily also drives us away a little bit of global outreach or footprint that we had before. And I think that also means that as Europe, we have to be smarter in how we actually do this outreach and how we work together, and how we think smarter about priority areas. And it's just more driven by necessity than it used to be.
And what do you think this means in particular for Europe's relationships with middle powers, particularly countries that, don't really fit neatly into the US-China rivalry, but are increasingly important for Europe's resilience?
Yeah, I think they're just becoming absolutely central to European security, also in terms of that sort of broader global challenges and sharing, sort of building a shared agenda, as was just mentioned. So yes, these countries, they don't want to be forced into the binary choice often between, choosing between the US and China. They want agency and they want partnerships that really do respond to their own priorities. And I think, what we're seeing in Europe is therefore you've got to build these much more tailored strategic partnerships. And in order to do that, Europe needs to think about how it builds coherence, both across policy areas, but also across member states and at the European level. I think a more unified approach would make us a more reliable partner, and we've written extensively about that at ODI Global and ODI Europe. And actually, we are doing some work at the moment looking at how Europe can build more cohesive country strategies in its partnerships and its approach to partnerships. And finally, I think, as we've mentioned, we really do need to broaden the scope of cooperation with these partners. So looking at how we can build security partnerships that also look at industrial policy partnerships, for example, or R&D, or the global gateway investment. How can you bring these different policy areas together in a coherent way that can really, work for the partner countries, but also work in enhancing European security?
Thanks, Dora. Ingeborg, I was just reflecting that, you and I have been involved for a long time in responding to humanitarian crises, and we're seeing some horrendous ones today, horrible conflicts in Sudan, in Gaza, obviously violence in the Sahel, crises are reinforcing each other. What does a security model look like that can respond to both immediate crises and to long-term structural fragility?
Yeah, well, I think that we're confronted with this complex issue that because of the fact that the geopolitical competition is on the rise, the world is more multipolar, there's less clear the direction that we're all heading in. We also face multiple crises, and it probably, I'm afraid it won't be less in the time to come, whereas our capacities are more strained. So it was always important. We always found it important to combine different instruments of foreign policy. Before, we always used to talk about the 3D approach: the diplomacy, defense, and development. And of course, I think that it's still important to look at it in a coherent way, because we have to think about both addressing root causes and consequences at the same time. I think diplomacy, mediation is a more important tool of foreign policy, but it's becoming a more important tool of foreign policy. And that we also feel that we're more, we're more subject of these mediation efforts ourselves. So we actually invest more in diplomacy. I think we need more investment in diplomacy because as you said in the beginning, the security frameworks that we had and that we took for granted for a long time, they are shifting. So it also requires us to connect issues more and to see if we can work across silos. Yeah, so coherence, I think, is a key word in doing this, because we realize that it's not a transition from crisis to recovery and development. It's not linear, right? We keep revisiting cycles. So we have to really invest in diplomacy and see how we can actually build on or work on problem solving.
Yeah, and truly also in a deeper understanding of the multiple threats that we are facing, which leads me to one final question for you all. Given that we are confronting a myriad of threats, we talked about obviously conflict, climate shocks, economic coercion, this fragmenting of well-established alliances. What is the one change that you believe Europe really must make now to be genuinely secure in 10 years' time?
I completely agree with the word previously said, coherence. So my strong view is we need strong coherence in assessing risks, on how we're working with partners. I think we already have a good range of tools at the European and the national level, but it's often that we're not sequencing them or coordinating them as effectively as we could. And so I think, trying to work on our alignment and bringing together all of these different policy areas under sort of one ecosystem of security could really help make a step change in how Europe engages in these issues.
Thanks, Dora.
one change, huh? Only once. So I would say really invest in developing, really achieving a culture of civil preparedness. Whether you want to call it civil preparedness, total defense, comprehensive security, that's entirely up to you. But what I mean is, if we agree that we are in a time of volatility and unpredictability, and it's not going to go away tomorrow, then I think we really need to build security resiliency by design deliberately, starting with our citizens, because that's, if there is one lesson that I think we can take from looking at Ukraine and Ukrainian bravery against the aggression, is how important it is to have a mobilized, active, and engaged civil society, and informed and prepared citizens, and how crucial that is to defense. So that would be my magic wand, one change.
I agree, Benedetta. I think for me, a lot of that is also linked to actually preparing our citizens in terms of understanding and using technology appropriately, and being mindful of the threats, and how much particularly social media are weaponized to develop sort of further threats. I think that is an area that requires a lot of attention. Ingeborg.
I'm actually had the advantage of being the last one, so several important issues were already mentioned, so I can just add another one. But I think in addition to what colleagues already said, I think having our story straight, like what are we actually, keep focusing on also on our own strength, and what it is that we actually hold dear, and build that story, and also don't lose confidence in our own strength.
Thank you so much, Ingeborg, Benedetta, and Dora. I think what comes through clearly from this conversation is that Europe's security challenge is not about spending more, not just about spending more, but it's about thinking differently. We're moving into a world where security can no longer be outsourced, where threats are no longer purely military, and where resilience really depends as much on institutions, on diplomacy, on civil society and cooperation as it does on deterrence. I think the assumptions that Europe relied on for decades are shifting. The long-standing alliances are clearly less reliable. The threat landscape is widening, and the partnerships inside and beyond Europe need to be rebuilt with far greater coherence and intent, as you've all very clearly said. And that means translating resources into real capabilities. It means breaking down silos between defense, diplomacy, and development, in the sense that it's important to invest not just in military strength, but in the political, social, and institutional foundations that make society secure in the first place. But you've also reminded us that this also means not losing confidence in Europe's own strength, and recognizing that long-term security is built with citizens and not just for them. If you're interested in more on this topic, you can find all of our work on this agenda in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Think Change.